The threat from terrorism continues in its pernicious and evil nature. But it's changed. Our strategy has to change too.
This past March, an ISIS attack on the Crocus City Hall Theater in Russia brought Islamic jihadism back into the headlines.
The level of threat is now greater than it was in the pre-withdrawal period.
Despite the fall of the ISIS caliphate in Syria and Iraq, the threat endures, with affiliates continuing asymmetric warfare worldwide. The Islamic State Khorasan province, or ISIS-K, claimed the Moscow attack, while ISIS affiliates surge in the Sahel.
So my assessment is that for a period of time, we will see this threat as growing.
How has ISIS transformed since the U.S. withdrawal in Afghanistan?
So there were more deaths overall globally, but less incidents. Basically, terrorism is becoming more lethal.
What are ISIS-K's objectives and tactics?
The conflict in Gaza has a compounding effect. That conflict is galvanizing ISIS supporters and al-Qaeda, as well as Shia militias, even as the U.S. is reducing its resources away from counterterrorism.
Are U.S. counterterrorism policies effective? And are they adapting to this evolving threat? Today, we're joined by Dr. Kim Cragin, Dr. Asfandyar, and Michael Collins. Michael Collins is Executive Director Americas of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Dr. Cragin is Director of the National Defense University's Center for Strategic Research and Distinguished Research Fellow for Special Operations and Counterterrorism. Dr. Asfandyar is Senior Expert in the South Asia Program at the United States Institute for Peace, whose research interests include U.S. counterterrorism policy and political violence with a regional focus on Afghanistan and Pakistan. Moderating the discussion is Joanna Gwevcheski.
So let me begin first with you, Kim, to kind of be the scene setter. Could you please talk about who is ISIS and how the Biden administration is confronting the threat from jihadism?
Great. Thanks, Joanna. And I guess let me start with my usual disclosure or caveat that although I work for the National Defense University and so I'm a federal employee, everything I say is my own view and I'm not speaking for the U.S. government or the Department of Defense. Okay, so beginning with the overview of ISIS. The full name is Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Some also refer to it as Daesh, and others just say the Islamic State. It has its roots in al-Qaeda, and it emerged onto the world stage in July 2014 after it essentially chased Iraqi security forces out of Mosul. And its then leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, stood at a lectern in the city's central mosque and announced the creation of a new Islamic State. ISIS eventually ruled over 11 million people in Iraq and Syria, and foreign fighters poured into ISIS-controlled territory, upwards of about 40,000. They were very much involved in attacks against the West, and ISIS orchestrated over 250 attacks against the West during the height of its power between the July 2014 and March 2019. At that time, the U.S. mobilized against ISIS, actually not really until there were attacks in Paris in November 2015. But unlike the efforts in Afghanistan or the surge in Iraq, there were only hundreds or maybe low thousands of U.S. troops that were deployed. And instead, the United States sent small numbers of military advisors who supported the Iraqi security forces and the Kurds, also known as the SDF, with close air support. By March 2019, ISIS had lost control of all of its territory, or most of its territory, in these two countries. So this brings me to Biden's current policy and the current administration's policy and how it differs from in the past. But before I answer that, and you alluded to this, I think it's important to stress that ISIS and al-Qaeda have not actually disappeared. And ISIS has branches in places like Central Asia and the Middle East, and I know other people are going to talk about those. It also has about 5,000 fighters in Syria and Iraq, and about another 9,000 in the SDF detention facilities that we are subsidizing and helping SDF maintain. The current approach to ISIS, and really all counterterrorism, so not just ISIS, is called over the horizon. And that is U.S. forces are postured outside a conflict zone, and then when intelligence identifies a threat, those forces cross international borders to execute an airstrike or a drone strike. against that threat or that plot. The rationale of this in the national security strategy is that the US is competing with Russia and China. Those countries are trying to reshape the world order. We're trying to prevent that. And so we need to be shifting resources away from counterterrorism and towards strategic competition. This doesn't mean that we're ignoring ISIS. And as you mentioned, General Kurilla just testified before Congress, and he stated that we've done 45 airstrikes against ISIS in 2023. And these, plus the ground operations by the Iraqis and the Kurds, has really kept enough pressure on ISIS so that it hasn't been growing and resuming its posture against us, at least out of Syria and Iraq. And that's not Afghanistan, which we'll talk about later. And also, you asked me to talk about Gaza, so I'll talk about it a little bit and say that the conflict in Gaza has a compounding effect. And that's what Christine Abazain was just referring to. Because that conflict is galvanizing ISIS supporters and Al-Qaeda, as well as Shia militias, even as the US is reducing its resources away from counterterrorism. And in fact, in that same testimony by General Kurilla, what he said is even worse. The limited resources that he now has that used to be dedicated towards counterterrorism are being used for strikes, force protection strikes in Iraq and Syria, as well as against the Houthis in the Red Sea to defend the shipping. And so as a result of that reduced pressure on ISIS, it is starting to recover even in Syria and Iraq. So I'll stop there as a sort of scary scene setter and hand it off to the other panelists.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kim. So now if I can turn to you, Asfandyar, to go kind of zero in on a specific part of the world. What was the impact of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan on ISIS? And what are some of the U.S. counterterrorism policy options for the U.S. in Afghanistan?
Joanna, thank you for having me. Thank you to Network 2020 for convening this conversation. And I'm honored to be on the panel with both Michael and Kim. So, as we think about post-withdrawal Afghanistan, I think an important starting point is the recognition that the structural environment that Afghanistan offers is very conducive for a range of different terrorist groups. Groups of different ideologies have opportunities for regrouping, plotting, and collaborating with one another. And these groups are also positioned to tap into what I believe is a vast pool of trained militant personnel, many of whom have been trained by the Taliban themselves for their war against the United States and the former Afghan government. And to some extent, we also find a similar pool of personnel across the border from Afghanistan in Pakistan. The groups, moreover, benefit from the reduced U.S. monitoring and other associated platforms that existed while the United States was present in the country. So this is kind of these are some of the structural features of today's Afghanistan in 2024 and its surrounding environs. And this structural environment has had a spillover. Terrorist groups are not only operating from inside Afghanistan, but increasingly operating across the borders of Afghanistan from Central Asia, as well as Pakistan, which in turn is adding to the terror threat, certainly to the regional countries, but also increasingly beyond those, the immediate neighborhood and region of Afghanistan. And in this environment, ISIS has really asserted itself, and specifically a branch of ISIS that you referred to earlier, ISIS Khorasan, ISIS-K, we like to call it ISIS-K here in Washington. It has presented a rising threat with reach, not just in the neighborhood, in the region, but beyond. And I would benchmark it. The level of threat is now greater than it was in the pre-withdrawal period. And this threat of ISIS-K is certainly rooted in Afghanistan, but it is also being channeled out of Central Asia and then parts of Pakistan. So what is driving this threat? And as I mentioned, ISIS, much like other terror groups in the region, is benefiting from reduced U.S. CT monitoring. There is also the factor of inspiration. The Taliban's victory in Afghanistan was certainly an iconic a moment, and all jihadist groups have drawn great inspiration from that particular feat. But then, the other sort of more surprising dimension of the threat is, or kind of what drives ISIS-K's threat, is its competition with the Taliban. ISIS in general, and then ISIS-K, which is the Afghanistan-specific branch, it is a hyper-competitive group. So not only is it sort of is it high on zealotry, but also high, this sense of competition. And with that sense of competition, it really opposes the Taliban and seeks to distinguish itself from Taliban or other jihadists who are more confined or limited in their ambitions. And this sense of competition really pushes, or is a source of impetus for ISIS Khorasan specifically, to strike in the wider region and then attempt attacks beyond the region in parts of Europe. And I would contend they certainly have the ambition to strike in the United States as well. So that's the sort of the threat picture, kind of where Afghanistan, or Afghanistan fits in ISIS's plans and calculus and political ambitions. I think the U.S. government is seeing three buckets of options to deal with this particular challenge. And the first bucket, I think there's been some conversation on this, in the public, involves working with regional countries to monitor and try to stop the threat, contain the threat in Afghanistan or in its immediate neighborhood. It's a workable solution, but it's also pretty tough. The United States doesn't have a relationship with Iran at all, so which is a key critical neighbor of Afghanistan. Then the US has had a complicated relationship with Pakistan, another key neighbor of Afghanistan, and the counterterrorism relationship with Pakistan, which was at one point very deep, it has atrophied. And then in Central Asia, there are some real limits as well. There's a lot of Russian influence in Central Asia, so that can come in the way of counterterrorism cooperation. The second option, on the other hand, involves going beyond the region and trying to, get the Taliban to go after ISIS Khorasan and in turn neutralize the threat. And this makes sense because the Taliban are the government of Afghanistan, and if ISIS is coming out of Afghanistan, then the Taliban can most likely do the most, at least more than many others in the region. And I think there are two sort of options here. You could try to pressure the Taliban, shame the Taliban into doing more on ISIS-K. And that gets us into the question of, okay, where is leverage and how do you shame the Taliban into better CT behavior? Or alternatively, and this is controversial, you can provide material assistance to the Taliban, including potentially intelligence. And this is, I imagine, deeply unpalatable to many people in the U.S. national security apparatus, and then of course the broader public, and so it's a difficult option. The final option involves, similar to what Kim was referring to in the context of Iraq and Syria, military action by the United States itself. We have not seen a lot of direct action by the U.S. government in Afghanistan since the U.S. withdrawal. We've seen one strike against the leader of Al-Qaeda in downtown Kabul. The Taliban were hosting him, and that's a very problematic sort of fact in of itself. But setting that aside, I think U.S. policymakers could consider military action against top ISIS targets, in particular those who are engaged in transnational plotting that we're seeing in, say, parts of Europe. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yes, so Afghanistan continues to be a very complex challenge. for the United States, for sure. So now turning to you, Michael, to kind of now look more at the big picture about terrorism. Your organization recently published the Global Terrorism Index for 2024. What were its main findings and about ISIS specifically?
Sure, Joanna. So the Global Terrorism Index, what it essentially does is it sort of provides a global count, I suppose you could say, of terrorist incidents and deaths and injuries and even kidnappings from terrorist groups, and kind of sort of compiles that and sort of looks at it in terms of overall trends, but also in terms of the longer term sort of socioeconomic impact that terrorism has around the world. I mean, one of the interesting things is that when you sort of look into the large scheme of things, terrorism in terms of overall deaths actually accounts for, very relatively few deaths worldwide compared to conflict and compared to homicide and even suicide around the world, for example. But it has a deep, social and emotional impact, right, in terms of every individual attack. And it's kind of sort of designed in that way. It's designed to create fear, designed to create panic. I think, to Asfandyar's point, I think potentially one of the reasons why some of the red flags are being missed is because, in terms of terrorism in the West specifically, we have been seeing sort of improvements in levels of terrorism essentially for the last 15 years, right? Primarily, most of the most recent attacks that we've seen in the West have been politically driven, whether it be kind of extreme left or extreme right, rather than sort of religious driven or religious extremism driven, such as is the case of as the Islamic State. There was a sort of other than Moscow, of course, which we wouldn't directly throw in the West bucket in this particular instance. There was an attack killing 2 people back in 2022, I believe. But since then, there hasn't been much, and a lot of the attention has kind of sort of turned internally. I do concur with the group, though, that the Islamic State continues to represent a significant threat. In fact, it continues to be the most deadly group worldwide as of today. We have seen sort of the growth of other terrorist groups, including Jainim in the Sahel, for example. But the Islamic State continues to be one of the core actors. Overall, in terms of terrorism, we have seen it recently over the last year deteriorate globally, and that does come off, however, sort of on a 3 or 4 years, but progressive years of improvement in terrorism since many of the sort of the harsh counterterrorism programs put into place that have led to significant reduction of terrorism in places like Iraq, for example. Although I think it was originally to Kim's point that ISIS is or the Islamic State is regrouping significantly in Syria. And of course, there's always a danger that they would expand from there into Iraq again, should the opportunity arise. But, one of the things that we've noted in the Global Terrorism Index specifically is this transition from terrorism. Number one, terrorism has become a lot more concentrated in a fewer number of countries. So there were more deaths overall globally, but less incidents. Basically, terrorism is becoming more lethal, going from 1.5 deaths per attack to 2.5 deaths per attack globally. And the Islamic State is becoming lethal in many ways as well. So it has sort of transitioned, as has the whole of terrorism, essentially, from sort of the MENA region to sub-Saharan Africa, obviously with the exception of the major Hamas attack in Israel. But more people died in Burkina Faso, for example, last year than they did through the Hamas attack. So Burkina Faso has become very much the epicenter of terrorism from a country, from a regional perspective, the Sahel, and then sub-Saharan Africa more broadly, all the way down to sort of Mozambique. And the Islamic State is a core player in all of those overall conflicts. So the Islamic State of West Africa just being one of them. Now, the Khorasan chapter is kind of sort of off to the right there, of course, to a certain extent. But all of these kind of sort of, affiliates intermingle with each other and coordinate to a degree. So again, I very much concur with the group that the Islamic State continues to be a significant threat. In the report this year, we did leverage some of the sort of the new technologies around AI and machine learning to be able to sort of provide an estimate. A lot of the attacks worldwide are more left unclaimed these days. Potentially because it's too small and maybe an embarrassment for the group, or alternatively too big and may elicit certain repercussions that they're not looking for. But by using machine learning, we'd be able to kind of sort of, do our best estimate of how many of these unclaimed attacks are potentially from the Islamic State as well, and that would essentially increase the amount of Islamic State attacks by 60% in all of these countries. So the Islamic State, in terms of Islamic State proper and its broader affiliates, are active in over 20 countries today. It's a lot. It is less than, back in 2014 when they were active. 2018, I should say, when they were active in more countries. Historically, they've been active in over 40 countries around the world. So it just speaks again to kind of sort of the potential footprint that they can have. And again, I mean, the potential opportunity that exists around a singular attack, such as the one that we saw recently in Moscow, are very much applicable here in the United States as well.
Network 2020 is dedicated to fostering understanding and building bridges across cultures. Through exclusive events, discussions, and networking opportunities, we're fostering a culture of understanding. Join us and become part of the mission to shape the future of foreign policy, one connection at a time. Donate or become a member today and help us to build a more informed, interconnected world. Click on the link in the description to learn more.
Now, I'd like to turn to you, Kim. It's something you had just briefly mentioned about the war in Gaza. How has it impacted ISIS and also U.S. counterterrorism policy?
Yeah, I think we're going to learn more and things are going to evolve as this conflict continues, although hopefully there will be a ceasefire. On again, off again, right? Nevertheless, I think that, as happens sometimes, the Hamas attack, just briefly, right? So Hamas did a barrage of missile attacks into Israel, and this hid or provided cover for teams to infiltrate into Israel, and they kidnapped a number of people and killed a number of people. The numbers off the top of my head are 1,400 were killed, and we didn't know exactly, but over 250 were kidnapped, right? So this was and this just sends shock waves across the counterterrorism community, both the audacity of the attack and then how it started to galvanize and motivate what the counterterrorism community calls lone actors, or individuals who don't seem to be tied to a terrorist group specifically. Probably they might be in very loose sort of social media senses, but not actually in a command and control sense. And these individuals are motivating. In fact, there was an arrest in April in Germany of a handful of teenagers, I think 4 or 5. And they discovered they were plotting because one of them, a young girl, was planning to go and join ISIS and leave and become a foreign fighter. So these sorts of attacks were galvanized by the conflict in Gaza. All right. So U.S. counterterrorism, then, as a result, you've got sort of twofold: how we're responding to Gaza. And like I mentioned, this is trying to stop the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. This is whatever support that we're providing to Israel. And then at the same time, with limited resources, continue to monitor and potentially strike threats against the homeland. And that's just a very complicated thing to do with limited resources. And so I think General Kurilla, back to him, since we're citing him, said within the next 6 months, we won't actually be able to see a plot coming out of Afghanistan. And so that's because you're seeing an attrition of our ability to continue to monitor things because we're focusing on the conflict in Gaza. That's just the reality of counterterrorism, sort of post withdrawal from Afghanistan, I would say 2021. But it's a challenge. And again, why you see counterterrorism people sort of sounding the alarm.
Yeah, no, I can imagine it's quite a daunting thought that you know the threat is there, but you don't have the resources that you really need to be able to address that threat. Yeah. So now I'll turn to you, Asfandyar. Recent ISIS attacks and threats in Iran, Russia, and Europe have come from ISIS-K, and you touched on ISIS-K briefly. Who is this faction, and what role do they play within ISIS?
Sure. So let me give some detail on the threat itself. What has the nature of the threat been, at least over the last 12 months? Several ISIS-K plots against U.S. interests have been detected in the last 12-month period. There've been arrests by Austrian, Dutch, German authorities. There's a credible suggestion that those arrests have disrupted actual plots. In some cases, funding networks. There are other reports from various parts of Europe of operatives or cells being taken down. So there seems to be a pretty constant hum of ISIS-K activity, and these cells, it appears that they're a real mixed bag in terms of how they are coming about. There is a possibility that some of these cells involve people who have been trained in Afghanistan before being sent overseas to undertake attacks, but that's kind of the more traditional model of external attack plotting. What we're now seeing, in particular from ISIS-K, is enablement, connecting operatives, say, who are based in the region with online supporters, who are then provided direction, instruction, and perhaps some kind of funding as well. And so ISIS-K is one of the main units of ISIS, which is able to pull off this kind of external attack or plotting activity, and that is kind of what sets it apart. ISIS Khorasan takes political direction from ISIS Iraq and Syria. There is evidence even in the open source that there is a layered bureaucratic structure which connects ISIS in Iraq and Syria to ISIS Khorasan. We have seen the US government, US Treasury in particular, pinpoint some nodes across the two organizations which exchange money. And so there have been financial flows from Iraq and Syria. Then ISIS Khorasan also works with other ISIS affiliates. So there are indications that ISIS Khorasan has been directed or has been assisted by the ISIS affiliate in Somalia. And that has triggered some U.S. military actions. The United States government neutralized an ISIS Somalia leader named Bilal al-Sudani. I think it was last year, because he had helped assisted ISIS Khorasan. And then there are other transnational linkages with the broader ISIS network. The suggestion, for example, of ISIS Khorasan receiving funds or being in touch with, in contact with, say, ISIS element cells in a place like Maldives. So in that sense, ISIS Khorasan is very much at the center of this sort of layered transnational network that ISIS has globally, with connection, with material ties, with political ties, and that's those connections, those networks, it appears, are enabling it to sort of play this role of being the vanguard of ISIS's sort of external attack ambitions.
Okay, so do you think it's likely that will continue, that its role will continue and grow?
Look, I am not seeing a lot of pressure on ISIS K or ISIS Khorasan's external attack capabilities in the region for now. The Taliban are certainly fighting ISIS K. I don't dispute that, but they are mostly going after parts of ISIS K that are fighting them. So parts of ISIS K which are engaged in an insurgency against the Taliban are very focused on that. And then the skill or the art of taking down external attack capabilities it requires some very specific skills, which I don't see the Taliban possessing. For example, counter-terrorist finance is critical to effective counterterrorism against such external attack infrastructures, and the Taliban are not doing much to beef up the counter-terror finance infrastructure, of their fledgling sort of Afghan state government, and I don't see them working with any sort of outside actor, not even one of their partners who might be assisting them with improving terror finance control. So my assessment is that for a period of time we will see this threat as growing, and I think we will need. I would have to see some real policy action either by the United States, by regional countries, or multilaterally to be convinced that this threat is now being checked.
Thank you so much. And then Michael, based on your research, what specific concerns does ISIS raise in the Sahel region and other parts of the world?
So, although it continues to be the deadliest organization, we have seen sort of a significant decrease in its activity overall, right, since the heyday of Iraq and Syria. So I think in that sense, its capacity has definitely been impacted. But again, it still remains the most deadly organization worldwide. And the thing about sort of the Sahel is that we're seeing a number of things. Obviously, incredibly porous borders, institutions, national institutions, i.e., governments who are not able to control many of the kind of sort of the rural regions, and therefore ISIS has the full ability to be able to kind of sort of move between one place and another. And even the efforts of in Operation Barkhane in the day, as well as Wagner forces right now, really have difficulty in being able to control ISIS. And of course, a lot of these institutional forces, whether those be good or bad or whatever the case may be, are also struggling. Bear in mind, with a whole other bunch of terrorist groups in that particular region as well. So that adds complexity. The problem is, that it is very rooted, very mobile, and increasingly leveraging a lot of the sort of the socioeconomic opportunities. I see sort of a question in the chat that we're more than happy to try and address about the control of potentially illicit economies, including artisanal gold mines and so on and so forth. So there's significant opportunity for ISIS to be able to move around these places, to be able to fund their own operations. And although they're not seeing the amount of growth that you would have seen prior to their heyday, they still continue to be a significant force. In the case of Afghanistan, I think it's very interesting dynamics. I don't fully understand them of course as much as Asfandyar does. It's actually probably a question for Asfandyar. We noted in the index that the overall number sort of attacks and deaths from the Khorasan chapter had deteriorated or had gone down over in 2023 compared to before. And of course, so the Islamic State would have been responsible for the attack, the Kabul airport attack, as an example of that. So invariably, the Islamic State was fighting with the United States in Afghanistan, which would have contributed to the larger number of attacks the year before, 2021 and 2022. But I just wonder if also the fact that the Taliban now has sort of full control of or is essentially, like you say, Asfandyar, the government in Afghanistan, whether it's simply, now that it doesn't have the distraction of the United States, whether that has increased, organically, holistically, its capacity to be able to address or fight the Khorasan chapter, even though it may not have a full counterterrorism strategy in place. So we did see a sort of a slight improvement along those metrics, but even in the case of the Khorasan chapter, continuing to be a considerable force.
Great, thank you so much. And now, Kim, you mentioned the difficulty of the U.S. to monitor multiple terrorist threats at once. Do you think ISIS is seeking to restore its conventional power with a more standard army and territory? Would this make counterterrorism efforts easier or harder for the United States, considering its other priorities in national security?
Such a good question. So my view of ISIS, both ISIS in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere, is that control over territory is a necessary part of their almost identity as a group. That they want to control territory and rule territory. Does it necessarily have to be territory as big as, the state of Oregon? No, right? And so historically, ISIS and Al Qaeda have taken control of small cities and ruled the city or the surrounding territory sort of in a de facto way. You see this in places, we've seen it historically in Yemen and even currently, and you see it in places like Somalia. So it doesn't have to be as dramatic as we saw in Syria and Iraq. The harder question to me is, does this make it harder or easier for the United States? Because this blends a little bit into sort of politics and what the United States is willing to take on and not take on, right? As Michael has been talking about, the Islamic State and other terrorist groups have a lot of activity in Africa, different parts of Africa where we're not directly involved in it. And so there's this line on when do policymakers feel the need to get involved, right? So with Syria and Iraq, it was actually after there were attacks in Paris that the United States really actively got involved. So I think that the control over the territory is easier for us to solve if there is an attack against the West. Because it galvanizes and it motivates the American people as well as American policymakers and raises it to a level where we have to do something. When there's control over the territory and the attacks aren't against us in the United States or against our strong allies in Western Europe, I think it's harder to do something because it requires a significant number of forces, a significant number of airstrikes, and a lot of resources. And so I think that's the trade-off, is it depends on if it's not just the control over territory, but what they're using the territory to do. And if they're using the territory to sponsor or enable attacks against us, then it is a little bit easier to have a defined territory and to do something about it, but it takes a higher level of forces to do that. And motivation and political will. So I'll just end there.
Great, thank you. Is there an opportunity to negotiate? Does ISIS and Al Qaeda have a leader who speaks and has control of the group, or are there independent groups in different countries? Who would like to try that?
I can perhaps just jump on very quickly. So, again, the challenge is half the time you don't know who's leading, right? I think it's currently al-Qurayshi, if I'm not mistaken, for the Islamic State. In all honesty, I don't even know who the head of Al Qaeda currently is. Oftentimes they change and chop, and of course, oftentimes all of these internal leaders are also fighting each other. So just because you're getting the official head of the Islamic State at any particular point, there are a lot of discrepancies, and internal differing ideologies between the affiliates and the provinces as well. So, I think that you're not necessarily, negotiating with the whole of the Islamic State. By negotiating with al-Qurayshi, you may see, perfect discrepancies between what the Khorasan chapter would be doing, or alternatively ISIS West Africa. But I think the rest of the group is a lot more qualified to answer.
I can come in on this question. I teach civil war, political violence, and I try to tell my teach my students that negotiations, political options are in fact a key part of the policy toolset that a lot of countries rely to manage internal security, non-state threats, but I think Al Qaeda and ISIS are different, and we have normatively sort of made a determination that that's not a path that we'd like to pursue, and these are bad actors, and there's certain red lines we're going to draw when it comes to sort of political options with respect to these actors. That being said, just for the record, I want to note that the Taliban, at least to the extent of the region, have been offering to arrange negotiations between various terrorist groups that they are friendly with, that they are providing a haven for, a sanctuary to, and regional government. So they helped arrange a negotiation between a group called the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. It's an anti-Pakistan terror group which has been fighting the Pakistanis for the last 15 years, has killed tens of thousands of Pakistani civilians and security forces personnel, and the Taliban are very friendly with this group. The Taliban arranged for a negotiation between Pakistan and this group. It ultimately collapsed, and the Taliban are keen on reviving that. But that's one thing they've done. The Taliban have also reportedly arranged a conversation between the Tajik government and some anti-Tajikistan jihadis that are based out of Afghanistan. And while the Taliban have never explicitly offered to arrange a negotiation between say Al Qaeda and the United States, it is not implausible that would be something that they may offer, but certainly no one has ever raised that with them, and I don't think that would be a particularly good idea.
The U.S. has had this long-standing policy of not negotiating with terrorists, and it goes back decades. And there has been a little bit of wiggle room on political hostages, as we've seen with Russia. But I don't see that changing. But that does not preclude the countries where the terrorist group are actually operating to negotiate with them. And as been alluded to, it's not uncommon for the countries where the conflict is actually taking place to engage with the terrorists and to negotiate with them and to try and erode support for them by acquiescing on some areas. And so I think those are two different things. And so I would split the question off in that way.
Great, thank you so much. Well, in the remaining minutes that we have, I wonder if we have one final question for each of you. And I will start with you, Michael, first. What do you think is the most important factor to counter the ISIS threat, both in the short and long run?
It's a really tough one. So one of the things that we sort of do in the Global Peace Index is the Global Terrorism Index, I should say, is we look at the length of existence of individual terrorist groups. The grand majority of terrorist groups don't last for more than 1 year, right? Either because they've been completely decapitated, or alternatively they merge into another group, or alternatively they achieve their aims essentially. It's really, really tough to weed out organizations that have been there for close to a decade, right? And the Khorasan chapter, I mean, of course, that applies to the Islamic State, but increasingly to the Khorasan chapter. Yes, short-term counterterrorism measures are invariably successful, but time and time again, we're in these situations in which we're providing that stabilization, providing that security, but doing very little on the sort of the development front to be able to address some of the underlying grievances. I realize it's a very generic statement, but it does very much sort of point to the need to realize, especially from a US foreign policy perspective, that any form of intervention is never going to be a clean sweep. I don't know exactly where we are with regards to, the full withdrawal of US troops from Iraq and so on and so forth. But ISIS is just waiting to step across the border, and any form of engagement like that is something that we need to be aware is 20-year, 30-year engagement. And I'm not an expert on Afghanistan by any means, and I do realize that we've been in Afghanistan already for a very, very, when I say we, I'm referring to the United States, for a very, very long time. But again, I don't think anything was fundamentally changed, right? The approach was purely a security one. Yes, I'm sure that there was a whole lot of investment in aiming to strengthen the Afghan institutions, but perhaps still very much with a security focus. So more emphasis, or at least the realization that that there should be an additional development focus, not only tacked on to the end of a securitized response, but an essential part of it.
Great, thank you. And Kim?
I was hoping you were going to ask me a different question.
Me too.
We were talking earlier before we got online about the Foreign Affairs article by Michael Morale, And he has this line in it that says that complacency is a greater risk than alarmism. And I actually have kind of come to that same point. I think that it's very easy to react to a big attack like the 9/11 attacks. And it's very hard to continue to just grind away at counterterrorism over time. Whether it's what Michael was talking about, which is sort of the social economic development and engagement or diplomatic engagement, which I was a big believer in 20 years ago and have gotten much more cynical over the past 20 years. And I tend to lean more towards the military or law enforcement finishes. But even the military and law enforcement finishes, the persistent activity and having to do it over and over again, even if there isn't this huge threat to the United States, it's just very hard to do. So to me, the most important factor is avoiding that complacency and the persistence and the need for that, and continuing to devote resources to it, even when it's not a crisis.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Asfandyar.
Sure. So I'll make two quick points here. One, I worry that the policy community sort of writ large, and not just people who are in government, but many on the outside, are starting to see a trade-off between strategic competition and CT. And I agree that in the way CT was done over the last 20 years, indeed, there was the trade-off. If you open big counterterrorism wars in at least two countries, and then you're doing a lot of overseas counterterrorism in other parts of the world. So there was a trade-off, but now we're not, and I worry that even at this stage, people think that somehow doing more stepped up counterterrorism for vigilance sake is going to take us away from focusing on the bigger priorities of the day, and I worry about that sort of diagnosis, or that sense that somehow doing more CT is bad for competing with China and Russia. And then related to that is kind of my second point, and I think this point has become I think my thinking on this has crystallized since October 7th, the Hamas attacks against Israel, which is this problem of the strategic vortex that mass casualty terrorism has the potential to generate. I think 9/11 in many ways did that. Attacks in Europe in the 2000s did that, and we're now seeing after the October 7th attack, which unleashed these societal forces, a lot of emotion, domestic political pathologies, which are just very hard to control for decision makers. And the best way to avoid that is to actually be vigilant and to do sort of proactive counterterrorism, so that we don't get caught up in these kinds of strategic vortexes, which take us away from the strategic priorities of the day, as well as compel policymakers to make sort of undesirable, normatively bad normative choices. So I think with that, I would stop there.
Right. Well, very appropriate way to end this fantastic discussion. It was so insightful and sobering at the same time. But I wanted to thank Kim, Asfandyar, and Michael for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. Voiceover host and editor for this episode is Casey Craig, with production support from Liam Austin and Brian Thom. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.